Hi, my name is actually Lena Donna Caroline Humphrey, but aka Donna Humphrey. I live in Mapley, and I came to England when I was 2 years old on the SS Ascania, which is an Italian ship from Trinidad, and I was born in Port of Spain. My family came, there was with my mother, my father, my three sisters, my two sisters, because my last sister was born in England. And we came over in 1961. Now, I was born in 1959, so I've got actually no memory of the journey over on the boat because I would have only been 2 years old. But I'm not sure, but there's kind of like a bit of a myth of a story that goes around about me constantly escaping the cabin. So they'd find me late at night wandering around this massive ship and having to be escorted back quite frequently to my room. And they couldn't figure out how I got out until they put a guard on the door. And then apparently I just opened the door very quietly, and because I was very small and very, very slim, I'd slide out of that door and I'd go wandering. And sometimes I wonder if that is like a metaphor for the rest of my life, where I was continuously wandering off somewhere. We landed in, obviously, in the docks at London. And as far as I know from my mother's reaction, it was, what are we doing here? Because the country was raining, it was grey. We just moved from this amazing tropical island, and then we came into the London docks. And I think it gave my mother a really big shock, because she wasn't sure what was happening and why she was there. So as far as we know, my mother wanted to go and take us to Canada, and we had all of the points that would have made us eligible for Canadian citizenship. But my dad, along with quite a few of his friends, had actually come to London, and so we ended up staying in Britain. I think my dad did say to my mum, if we don't like it after 3 months, we'll go. But I'm not sure he was really telling the truth. My first reaction was when I realised that I was part of what's known as the Windrush generation was, oh God, not another label slapped on my head. And it was kind of first my initial reaction, and that's because I was sick to death of having whatever masses of labels of who I was, where I come from, am I an immigrant, am I British, am I this? And it's only really as I've taken ownership of, because I didn't even know there was a label called the Windrush generation, that I've taken ownership of it. And it's quite a proud thing to be a part of. So yeah, I have changed it's not an attitude, I just didn't know it existed, but now I'm really proud of it, really proud of it. Growing up in Coventry was quite an important part, especially during the era of when the specials and the selector were on the rise. Now, I was living in Coventry at that time, I was young enough to remember it. There was correspondingly the rise of the right-wing National Front, which had come to the fore. It was a very, very violent and abusive time, and quite a frightening time. So I remember being very careful about Saturdays being found on the streets on a Saturday, because especially after a match, because there was also the rise of the thugs and the hooliganisms that was all then connected, and having these psychological memories of being afraid of being caught in that and being chased through the streets. And I do remember that quite clearly. And maybe some of the exciting part was I want to get this out there, I actually worked with the specials. I did my internship with them in London for two main summers. So I did like some tours with them. That was a fantastic period, and that was the most amazing experience working with these groups of people that were working really hard against being anti-racist. We were coming back from the Moonlight Club in London, and there was Linville Golding, myself, Sarah and her sister Debs, who were basically working with the selector and the specials. And we were attacked by two men who first attacked Linville, and they were beating him up. And all I remember is this moment where one guy went round the back and picked up a piece of scaffolding. And I remember he swung. I looked into his eyes, and I have never seen such blind, naked hatred in my life. And he swung the scaffolding post at my back. And within a split second, I had to fly up the stairs, hit the balcony at the top to stop myself from falling over. And I remember in that fraction of a second, he could have shattered my back for life. It was an incredibly difficult period. There is no two ways about it. In terms of isolation as a school kid, knowing that you would never be invited to people's parties or to their houses, that you were always going to be excluded. Because this has always been a very profound memory for me, was especially since the film Barbie came out. Now, I used to have a doll called Tessa, and Tessa was obviously your archetypal, stereotypical white doll. But what was interesting is that you'd press her tummy and her hair would grow out the top of her head. But what was profoundly important for me was being, at the age of 7, extremely aware of racism. And I remember this moment in the corridor of my house where I had this doll, and I remember wishing, just for that moment, or not even wishing, but knowing that if I was white, my life would be so much incredibly easier. And it was at that moment at 7 that I remember thinking, I will never, ever, ever wish for this again. And I had to make a very, very strong decision that I would never want to be anything else but who I was. But I think for me, that's kind of like a really profound memory of growing up in London and living through that particular era. So, and I wanted to really put this across because I think it's probably significant of an awful lot of maybe young black girls and boys, that the awareness of what was happening at that time was very, very, very strong. I mean, there were some lovely moments. I mean, we had sort of friends mainly with other immigrant families. So we had a really lovely family, an Italian family that had emigrated, and we were quite close to them for quite a while. So in some ways, it was a kind of a bit of a mixture between that awareness of racism, but also being young enough and resilient enough that you would just get on with your life, and probably shielded to a certain extent from an awful lot of that. I mean, one of the important parts was that my father always said to, because we had, by that time we had, we've got four sisters, I've got sisters, so there's 4 of us. And he'd always line us up, and he'd always say to us, you have to recognize that being young black women or black girls, you're going to have to work harder than anybody else, and you're going to have to work and prove yourself a lot stronger. So that was a theme that was very much instilled in us, that we were going to have to work harder, prove ourselves harder. And that was quite important. But at the same time, whilst we have all of those issues, I remember huge amounts of laughter in our house. I mean, I think we were probably classified as the loudest family on the street, because we would either be having scraps as young girls, but we would also be laughing a huge amount. And there was lots of jazz in our house and swing music and lots of Caribbean sort of songs. So that was that lovely mixture of having that kind of experience of both the racism and the difficulties outside, but also having that huge amount of fun and laughter. There were difficult times, and I'm not going to say that there were some very, very dark periods, but on the whole, there are some good memories. I'd lived in Italy for about 6 years and Greece for 2 years, so I came back when I was about 30. And at that time, I was working in English language education, so I was teaching in Surrey, then I went up to Edinburgh. And I saw this application for a job in Nottingham. Now, I'd been to Nottingham quite a few times because my sister lives here and she graduated here in Nottingham. And I kind of thought I really wanted to be back within an area where all my family were. So I have one sister in Derby, my parents were in Coventry, and my sister was in Nottingham. So this became the ideal location. And then this job came up. And the funniest thing is I went off to the interview thinking it was for to be an English language teacher. And all of the information about the job from Nottingham Trent University arrived after I left. So I arrived at this interview and I sat there and I looked at the other people and I said, like, what is this job? What are we doing? And they said, oh, it's to open up a language centre for English language education or to be a part of it. And my heart sank. I had no idea about how to open up a language centre, how to run a business. But I went into the interview, got really excited about it all because I'd obviously worked in that industry for a while, and told them all of these amazing things that they could do. Walked out of that interview and said, whoever takes that job is the biggest idiot that's walked on this planet. Went back to Edinburgh and I got the job. And I remember ringing my mum going, what am I doing? I can't possibly do this. And she said, if you hate it after 3 months, you can always walk. 30 years later, I'd set up a language centre within a year. I'd got the international students onto a supportive language programme with English for academic purposes, and went on to establish it as an important, significant part of Nottingham Trent University, and then went on to teach intercultural communication across the university in different departments and had that established. So that's how I ended up in Nottingham and has never left for 30 years. I love the city. It's great. My mum, because she was actually one of those very rare women in Trinidad who actually qualified with a draftsperson's architect diploma. So she had lots of ambition and lots of really wanting to achieve things. So when we came to England, she wanted to retrain as an architect, because obviously with the buildings and the structures, it was all very different. But we didn't have the money. So she could never, ever, ever fulfill her ambition to be what she wanted to be, which is an architect, which was very difficult during that period anyway for a woman, because it was a woman's place was in the home. You know, my mother wouldn't be able to get hire purchase without my father's signature on documents. And so she ended up working probably, I think, with AEI, which became the General Electric Company, GEC, mainly as a press secretary and that sort of thing. I think my father's ambition was also very stunted. I mean, you know, he ended up being a sales engineer for GEC, so he had a good job, but probably never ever fulfilling what he would have really wanted to be. They would have definitely encountered an awful lot of racism. My father never ever spoke about it, but he never really spoke about his childhood or the things that, how he grew up. So it's one of the saddest things, I think, is that we never ever interrogated him really properly, or interviewed him, I should say, rather than pin him down and interrogate him about his life. And I think that is the one thing I would always say to everybody: talk to your parents. I went back to Trinidad when I was 30 for the first time. My sister Alison and my sister Sarah came with us, so the three of us arrived. And the loveliest moment, we landed in Tobago, and as soon as we hit the customs, the customs officer just simply said, "Welcome home, girls." And it was just this absolutely wonderful moment. And then we stayed on Tobago for a while, and then went to Trinidad and stayed with family out there. And that was an interesting experience. Then I actually went back this year for the first time after 30 years again with my friend Elaine. And so we went to stay in Trinidad for about 5 days, 6 days before we flew to St. Lucia. And again, meeting up with family was fantastic. But what was really funny, what I thought was funny, again, the customs officer was absolutely shocked that I hadn't been back for 30 years and told me off. And then when we were only going to be there for 5 days, he told me off again. And then he said, when are you coming back? I said, I don't know. What? You don't know? Come back. And he was so it was quite interesting that just being there, being told off constantly for not having gone home for many, many years. On my mother's side, we're kind of like this hybrid of so many different things, but obviously we have to have African origins in us, but it's really interesting that my cousins tend to keep more of the record of the Italian Corsican side of it. And again, we're not entirely sure about the origins, but I suspect that there may have been a little bit of French in there, but also obviously African origin as well. So parts of our family are probably not really, it's very difficult to trace us back. We suspect that probably we're maybe from Nigeria originally, because we were looking at what would have been the fastest route on the Atlantic slave trade, that maybe from that area of the world that we came from. So that's as much as we actually know. So this is my photographs of my grandmother and grandfather on my father's side. So we have Janie Humphrey, née Charles, who is wife of Alban Humphrey, and she's with my sister, my eldest sister, Joanne. And this is my granddad, Alban Humphrey, who is the father of my father, obviously Geoffrey Humphrey, and he's my grandfather in the photograph. So it's quite nice to see photographs of my grandparents, because I never met them, unfortunately. They died before I was able to ever meet them. So this is a picture of me on the day that I received my first Holy Communion, and you can see that I'm in a wedding dress, because it literally was a wedding dress, which was an important way to show that we had wedded ourselves to God. And you'll probably be able to spot me just here, looking very, very holy. And there I am. And this is a photograph of my grandmother, Leonora Giuseppe. And I was very fortunate to actually meet my grandmother when she came to England. But she was a very scary lady. Very fierce, very powerful. But on the other hand, she had 11 kids. My grandfather had died, and she had to keep 11 children in order. So she needed to be fierce, and she needed to be a powerful, powerful woman to be able to bring up her children as well as that she did. And they all went on to do really remarkable things. So good on my grandma. Scared me, but good on my grandma. And this is a photograph of my lovely parents, and that is Lena Humphrey, née Giuseppe, and this is a photograph of my father, very dapper, and this is Geoffrey Gilbert Humphrey. And so it's two lovely photographs of two lovely people. So this article is really quite important, because my mother basically was one of the only draftsmen in the Caribbean. And as a female, it was not normal for women to actually be able to graduate in a diploma in draftsmanship and architect. And so when she went abroad to go to another Caribbean country for holidays, they constantly started taking photographs and writing articles about her, because she would have been seen as a complete rare being. And I love the title of this. This girl's place is not in the home. And this is one of my favourite memories of the generally